Good evening and welcome to Uncensored. Thanks for being with us this week. I'm your host, Bruce McAllister. This is a political talk show where we discuss the issues of the day from every angle. Western Standard does not accept government money, so we're not married to any government narrative. We will discuss things that the mainstream media doesn't, frankly. And today we're going to discuss COVID, the latest variant that has the world taking notice and some would say overreacting. We're going to talk about what governments might be doing instead and all of the things to do with COVID. Our guests, let's bring them up and introduce them as usual. First, we've got Danielle Smith. Danielle, the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group, former leader of the Wild Rose Party, and well-known common sense conservative commentator. Good evening, Danielle.
Hello, Bruce.
And we say hello to Rob Anderson, litigator in Airdrie, two-term MLA in Airdrie, and also author of the Free Alberta Strategy, which a lot of Albertans are talking about these days. Rob, good to see you.
Good to see you, Bruce.
Well, let's start with the Omicron variant. Is it overblown? Is it overhyped? Is it hysteria, Danielle, that we're watching?
I can't believe that we're still in this situation some 20 months after the fact, where the only thing that comes up as a solution anytime we have something that looks like it might be scary is to talk about travel bans and travel restrictions and shutting down borders. Dr. Joe Vipond, who seems to be the only doctor anybody ever quotes, he wants Alberta's borders to be shut down. And very early on, the international media was reporting on what the manifestation is of this new variant. And it sounds like it's morphed into a mild cold. It doesn't even have the telltale sign of losing your sense of taste and smell. And that shouldn't be that surprising because coronaviruses generally do manifest as mild to moderate colds. And we've only had 3 that have become deadly. We have MERS and SARS-1 and now SARS-2. And this should be something that we look at as good news. If it is the case that this virus is following the normal path, that it is mutating to become less deadly but more easily spread, that is actually a positive thing. And the politicians need to stop panicking and they need to start giving some real science to the public so they can get them out of this sense of fear that they have.
I wonder how much the media plays into this, Rob. I'll let you pick up on what Danielle said and maybe add to it. If you watch the newscasts leading off the day that the new variant was announced, I mean, it was all fear all the time, run and hide.
Yeah, the collective bedwetting by the media is astonishing. As you just watch it and you just kind of shake your head. But I think I hope people now want to move on here. I mean, we are destroying every time we allow another variant, which will happen every 6 to 8 months to a year, generally during flu season, as these variants come on board. If we allow them to shut down our economy, shut down our school system, force everyone to get a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th vaccine, etc. This is becoming abusive to children. This is becoming an attack on people's, obviously, their rights. People are getting fired for not getting vaccinated, and it's all driven by fear. And I just see it again and again and again. And this latest mutation is just the latest.
Okay, I'll stay with you, Rob, this time to pick this one up first. I always say I like to play the devil's advocate and try and look at things the way that the government is so that we cover it from all angles. Doesn't necessarily mean that I believe it, but what you're hearing is close the borders, ban flights from some of these African countries. We don't want a repeat of what we had this summer. Do you buy into that they're putting Canadian safety first?
No, it's an ignorant and cowardly suggestion. What these folks, Danielle quoted a couple of them, are suggesting. They're frankly, it's selfish, and as I said, it's abusive to children and frankly to adults. What governments need to do is they need to say, guys, look, we need to understand that we're going to be living with this virus and variants of this virus for a long time. So those are in at-risk groups, get vaccinated. Those who aren't, you have access to vaccinations if you want them, but we're not going to force it onto you. We're going to ramp up surge capacity, especially in flu season. We're going to allow doctors to prescribe preventative and post-diagnostic diagnostic treatments to their patients, but after consulting with them, we're going to stop this top-down bureaucratic approach to managing this virus going forward and start treating it like a regular flu virus going forward. Otherwise, we're going to be 5-10 years here and still talking about this garbage, and it's got to stop.
Dee?
Well, and the leadership has to come from the politicians. So I'll cut my friends in the mainstream media a little bit of slack, because everything that they say and report on comes out of the mouth from either a politician or a chief medical officer or some self-appointed expert from the medical community. And look who led the charge in asking for a travel ban. Started with Premier Doug Ford, and then it was piled on by Premier Jason Kenney. And so the two guys of three. I mean, I think if I was to look for an outbreak of freedom anywhere in the country, I would be looking first to Alberta, then to Saskatchewan, then to New Brunswick, and then to Ontario. But if we're going to see that our conservative leaders are the ones who are leading the charge of the hysteria, we're not going to get out of it. Because I think we all know that what we've seen so far is everything that they have done. The opposition has said it's not far enough, not fast enough, not deep enough, not authoritarian enough. And so what has occurred now is, I think, because the premiers have been so beaten up and so resistant to looking at some of the red states in the US and how they're managing this, that they're going to now be the first to want to jump on more extreme measures, because they want to demonstrate that they're not going to be soft on these issues. And that, I think, is the real danger, is that rather than chart the course that Rob talked about, which is absolutely the right messaging, I think there's a real danger that we're going to go the other way. And that we're going to start seeing more restrictions just because the premiers are trying to make up for loosening things up in the past. And that is not going to get us out of this at all. That is going to perpetuate it, if not for 1 or 2 more seasons, as long as Rob is saying, years.
Well, it's terribly frightening because nobody sees an end in sight. There's so much there to pick up on. Let's start with this one, the travel restrictions for Canadians. If you're unvaccinated and you want to get on a plane to see a dying loved one, you want to attend a funeral, heck, you want to take your family away for a little mental health break over the winter break, you can't fly out of Canada. And if I believe, if I'm correct, you can't get on a train either. Is this even constitutional, what we're seeing? And is it going to be challenged? Danielle, have you heard anything about that?
Well, when you look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the notwithstanding clause applies to only a handful of sections, section 7 to 15. Mobility rights are section 6. You have the right to enter and exit your country. You have the right to move about freely in your country. And here's the problem is I get the sense that politicians are doing things outside the law, outside a legislative mandate, and basically just waiting for the courts to come after them. Because what they've seen, and sadly, I hope we see some wins with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, but we haven't seen any so far. It seems like we've got a system where public health trumps everything. I didn't realize that the charter ceased to exist as soon as we had a public health emergency declared by the World Health Organization. And that appears to be the case, is that, and they've even argued this out in court, where Justice Center lawyers have said the charter does not trump the Public Health Act, or does the Public Health Act does not trump the charter, and the respondents have said actually it does. And so that's the real danger that we have here, is that if politicians have realized that they can pretty well do whatever they want with or without the legislature, with or without a governing budget, with or without oversight from the courts, with or without any effective check on their power, why wouldn't they keep on amping up the concern about variants and just maintain this system? It's a pretty easy way to govern if you don't have accountability.
You know, I always thought a law degree would be pretty useful, particularly for these conversations, but we see so many examples of where we wonder what the law actually says. We're lucky we've got a lawyer on our panel with us. Rob, what do you make of it? I mean, the emotional argument, frankly, that Canadians can't fly, they can't travel out of the country, and is it even legal to do?
Well, it's certainly, Daniel's right. Our mobility rights are supposed to protect us from government intrusion and interfering with our ability to move around the country. to fly in and out or travel in and out of the country and so forth. And that's very clear in case law. I mean, it's not even controversial until the last couple of years, where you've had these government mandates restricting travel, even not just international travel, but within the country. It's insane. It's if rule of law doesn't exist anymore. And you know what I am seeing though, and what is encouraging though, and we'll get to Mayor Gondak's kind of backtrack and some of these other backtracks that are going on with AHS and so forth, is that I think they have gone too far, some of these agencies, and they're realizing that if this does get into court, there's going to be a problem. I know that our firm is working on several cases in this area as well. I'm not going to go into details at this time, but the point is that I think, for example, the mandatory vaccine policy for everybody that works up from AHS, not just those who work with older people or at-risk groups. Some of these things, people are starting to look at them in the judicial system and among lawyers and so forth, and saying that is not a reasonable restriction. And although we have to respect the government's role in making sure public health is protected, we have to do it in a way that is the least intrusive possible to the people that are being affected by these mandates, while still achieving the goal of public health. And right now that balance is clearly out of whack. This one size fits all approach, mandatory vaccination policy, is insane. It's unconstitutional. And hopefully, I hope that pretty soon the courts are going to start ruling on this, and we're going to start to see the charter make a comeback.
I hope you're right, but here's the thing that's a bit frustrating, and whoever jumps in first, go ahead. If you're just an average everyday Canadian and you want to plan a trip with your family, I mean, you're probably not. You don't have the means, or maybe the skill to coordinate a legal defense to protest these things. A lot of people are just throwing their hands up in the air and saying, "Gosh, when will this all end? There's not much we can do about it." And democracy is, as we know it, is changing. I mean, we're losing a lot of our personal freedoms here, are we not?
Oh, we're losing a lot of our personal freedoms, and I don't know what the pathway is to get them back. I mean, I'm hopeful that at some point the courts are going to start functioning properly again, or maybe a courageous politician is going to emerge somewhere in Canada. I mean, I look at the US, and I think we all look down at the US and we say, why is it that places like Florida and South Dakota and Texas and elsewhere, why is it that they're able to get by with allowing choice, allowing people to mask if they choose, allowing businesses to ask for proof of vaccination if they choose, and if they don't, they don't. I mean, it could be that is where we have to go. I recognize that Calgary and Edmonton in particular, but probably some of the other centers, they are going to be a lot more reluctant to give up some of those restrictions. Just look at who they elected in both Calgary and Edmonton. That's a sign that is, I think, what Calgarians and Edmontonians want. But if you start allowing some freedom in some of the outlying areas, the smaller communities, the small towns, then eventually you're going to sow the seeds of some real conversation about, okay, well, if they've managed to have some freedom and the world hasn't ended, maybe we can start seeing some freedom in Calgary and Edmonton too. I recognize everybody's got to come along at a different pace, but one of the problems that we've had with the Premier's approach is he hasn't taken a regional approach. He really should have had a more restrictive policy, as they were demanding in Calgary and Edmonton, and a more liberal policy in the outlying areas. If he'd had 30 constituencies or so that were able to get pretty much back to normal, the way we see happening in a lot of the US states, I don't think he'd be facing the war within his party that he is right now.
Rob?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think I call it the DeSantis approach, right? Like, it's not like he's suffering any kind of political downside for acting courageous on this issue. At the very beginning, obviously, Governor DeSantis, was certainly taking heat from the media, but he stuck to his guns, and he's reaping the rewards of that. And I'm a little bit perplexed as to why Premier Kenny and Premier Moe and some of these other Premier Ford, obviously, who's gone way off the track with regards to personal freedoms and so forth, why they don't see this and understand that if you act courageously with common sense, give choice, promote vaccinations as an effective way to protect at-risk groups and all those that want them, but not force them on people. There's a successful political path there, but you have to be courageous. You have to stand up to the wailing and the gnashing of teeth of the media, and just do it. And in my view, Jason Kenney has really missed the boat on this. And I agree with Danielle. I hope there's political leadership that comes along in this country and says, hey guys and gals, we don't need to do it this way. We can respect personal freedom, we can respect the charter, and we can still protect public health.
Well,
I should say this, Bruce.
Ahead,
I feel like it might be getting even a little bit out of politicians' control. I was at an Oilers game last night, Rob. I know you're going to be jealous. It was Oilers and Penguins last night, and they were lucky. The arena was stacked with a lot of young people, and they, of course, had the big sign about having to go to the vaccine station, and everyone was piling in. But what I didn't observe was any fear whatsoever about Omicron, and I think that this is part of the success of the message. The message has been, if you're vaccinated, then you have a lower level of risk associated with getting sick, getting hospitalized, and dying. They can't now do a 180 and say, after all of this messaging that we've had for you for the last year, that this was the solution, to now tell you, ooh, it's not the solution. Because what is that going to do to vaccine hesitancy? If you go through and you get double jabbed, I guess they've now announced triple jabs for everyone, that's not a measure of confidence. That actually is undermining the message that these things work. Because if we're going to be in a situation like they are in Israel, where I think they're on their 4th jab now, is that the future? Is that it's 2 jabs a year, every year, forever? Are people going to put up with that?
Let's follow this up, Dee, right here. This is the point that I wanted to raise tonight. I hear and read enough outside the mainstream media that people say, okay, I got the first 2 jabs. I don't know about the next booster and the next booster. Is there a point where the public says, okay, is booster number 5 enough to say? I mean, Big Pharma's loving this, right? Like I haven't been following their stock lately, but I'm sure they're doing fine. The point is that this isn't like the vaccines that everybody talks about for polio, et cetera, where, you got your shot and you were good. This is something that we're apparently having to get every 3 or 6 months. And is there a stomach for that? Is society gonna go for this?
Well, I think there is going to be a line, but where that line is, I don't know anymore. I thought that was going to be a year ago that the line was crossed on this, and here we are. We're still going. But I think the starting position is we have to identify some of the untruths or the mistakes of the past that have been kind of pronounced by these public health officials and politicians. And one of them, for example, is that, the reason we all want you to get vaccinated is because we don't want you to transmit it to other people, that somehow being vaccinated is going to keep it from being transmitted greatly. And so it's your public responsibility, and that's why we're going to essentially mandate these things, et cetera. Well, that turned out to be garbage. Like, it's just false. I mean, you got entire hockey teams who are young, fit people, completely vaccinated, like the New York Islanders and the Ottawa Senators, having half their team get COVID after being vaxxed and having to shut down their games and so forth. This is not true. And so people need to take a look and say, okay, if it's not affecting transmission, if it's not making a difference in that scope, then the only reason to get it is personal. Will it protect me? And that's a personal choice. You can't force someone to take a vaccine because that they're unwilling to take because that you believe it will help them. That's not how liberty over one's body works. And we have to get back to that core principle that people need to be personally responsible for their own bodies. And if they don't want to get a vaccine, they don't have to get a vaccine, especially when it doesn't affect transmissibility.
Danielle, answer the same question, and I'll ask you. I love putting you on the spot because you never know what you're going to say. I mean, is there a number where you say, okay, no, I won't get the third or the fourth or the fifth booster?
To Rob's point, I mean, I think he's absolutely right that, and let me put it out on the table. I didn't get the Pfizer vaccine because by the time I believed the government when they told me that they were not going to force vaccination. So I thought, okay, well, I'll be one of the 30%. And then when they did force vaccination, we were already beginning to see the results of Israel. And I thought, you know what, if this is the way it's going, that your life gets turned on and off and your Vax Pass gets turned on and off with each new booster, I want to try a different choice. So I went down and got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And so maybe they'll have a second booster for that. I'm not sure. I still feel like because of the delivery mechanism being an adenovirus, I just feel a little bit more comfortable with it being a bit more of a traditional type of vaccine. And so it has, they did order some of the Johnson & Johnson doses. So if I got forced as a method of having to participate in society to have to get a second one, I probably would get that. But that's the position I'm in now. And I think a lot of people are. I didn't get vaccinated because I have some great fear of being hospitalized. I know my level of risk. I should mention, you can go to Cleveland Clinic and they've got a little website where you can type in your age and your pre-existing conditions and they will tell you your risk of hospitalization. I bet most people don't know. And one more thing to Rob's point, if Omicron is in Canada, and if we have the rule that you can only travel if you're vaccinated, it is by definition then being spread by people who are vaccinated, which underscores the fact that this division that we have in society where we're treating unvaxxed people like outcasts is absurd. And that's got to end immediately. If we're going to be worried about new variants that can bypass vaccination, then there is no reason to have vaccine passports anymore. And those should end immediately.
Well, there is nothing that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up more than that, than dividing people into unvaxxed and vaxxed. History has done this before, and it has not ended well. I want to ask you a little bit about the mainstream media, and I want to preface my comments by saying this. I spent 20 years in the mainstream media and had a wonderful career there, and have wonderful many friends that are great people to this day. And so I'm not typically the guy to be dumping on the MSM. However, here's my issue. When you see 100,000 people, tens of thousands of people for sure in the streets of Australia, in Rome and other places, protesting freedoms, for freedom, against vaccine mandates and passports, that is news. That is newsworthy. But the mainstream media is not reporting it. So people that don't watch, don't read alternative news feeds, or see YouTube clips and these kinds of things from other sources, they don't necessarily know what's going on over the world. This is frustrating to me. And Danielle, or maybe Rob, I'll start with you this time. It almost seems like this is a government narrative to not follow because it goes against the grain of what the government is trying to tell us.
Well, there are some honest journalists, but at the end of the day, especially in Canada, the mainstream media is bought and paid for. It's that simple. And it's the Trudeau government and the grants that they provided the mainstream media, the manipulation that they have in various regulations and so forth to empower the media to essentially perpetrate and advance their agenda it's not debatable anymore. So what people need to understand is that the mainstream media is nothing more than the communications. I would say the communications department of the current Liberal government and their policy on COVID. And I'm not saying that's the same worldwide, but I'm speaking to Canada here. So they're not going to get a fair shake in the media, and we have to accept that and move on to other independent forms of media. I'm kind of done with the mainstream media. I think their influence is weakening by the day. I think they're just, essentially they'll just be considered one source of information that everybody knows is biased in one direction, and so be it. But they've lost all neutrality, and most people just don't believe what they hear, and they don't watch. So that's why.
Well, pick up on that, Danielle. Rob, very good points there. But Danielle, I would challenge some of what Rob said. A lot of people still get their nightly news from their local news stations and read their local newspapers. And if they're not seeing these things that are happening across the globe, they're not really aware of them. I mean, what do you want to add?
Well, it's true. There's sort of it's bisected, and isn't all of society divided this way? I think probably the older you are, you probably go to the mainstream sources. So you'll turn on the evening news because you got into the habit of doing it over the last 60 years. And you'll maybe pick up the morning newspaper and you'll listen to the radio, have it on in the background for company. So I think that there is a group of people who are getting nothing but fear every single moment from every source that they go to. But then if you're younger and you kind of grew up with the instant access to whatever it is you wanted on your iPhone, I swear I probably see more videos that are sent to me from some alternative source than I see in regular mainstream media. There's a really great documentary on right now, 9-part series. It's called thereveal.com, and they're releasing one each day. And they've got brilliant interviews with Robert Malone, the doctor who created mRNA vaccines, and Peter McCullough, who was the first in Texas to start looking at a treatment protocol. And so the fact that that information is getting out is great. The fact that it's not crossing over into the mainstream media is a real problem. And the only reason I can really think why that is that it seems like there is this paradigm, which is anything that might cause vaccine hesitancy cannot be reported on. So we can't report on therapeutics because then someone might not get a vaccine. We can't report on vaccine injury because then someone might not get a vaccine. We can't report on all the people who are opposing lockdowns and restrictions because that might create hesitancy to vaccine. And so that shouldn't be the paradigm, though. The paradigm should be, what are the concerns being raised? And is there a person we can put on to counter? Because I spent time in the mainstream media too.
Exactly.
And that was always the point, is it should have been point, counterpoint, and then independent observer saying, this is what I've heard and this is what I think. We're not getting that. We're getting sole source stories now. We're not getting the balance.
If I could just break in real quick, Bruce.
Go ahead.
Just real quick.
Go ahead.
So I want to be very clear. Like, when I say the mainstream media, I don't mean every reporter, newscaster, and so forth. You have to understand, and I'll let Danielle speak to it. Perhaps she has some experience with this. I don't know. But in a lot of situations, it is the managing editor who takes the editor that takes their commands from up above, from their ownership group and so forth, who owns the paper or the media outlet and so forth. And they give the marching orders to the editor, who gives the marching order to the newscaster. That's how this works. And that's why people shouldn't be surprised, because the companies that own these news outlets, because they're worried sick about the perception or the woke crowd or being against the science, quote unquote, the directions to their people are, you don't cover this. And that's why you're
losing their funding.
Yeah. Or you lose your fund from the federal liberal government, of course. That's the other issue.
Look, that was a very good point to raise, Rob, because, having been in story meetings for decades, there is definitely a push from up above that makes it to the managers, that then makes it to the reporters. But I always said when I was in the newsroom, look, the story isn't created around this table. The story is created out there. And if you've got tens or hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, that's a story. And no bureaucrat or government-funded institution should be saying otherwise. It's curiosity, and it's the 5 Ws. So apologies for my little rant, but I'd like to see more of it in the mainstream media. One example that you did mention of things that we didn't cover, suicides, for instance. We were particularly cautious about that. You don't want to I don't know what the right word is here, but you don't want to encourage that kind of activity. Yes, exactly. So I remember as a young journalist, my first experience was somebody on the McDonald Bridge in Halifax, and between Halifax and Dartmouth, and the road was closed off, and I was a young cub reporter and wanted to explain what was going on, and we realized what was going on, and we didn't draw attention to it. But this is, as you say, Rob, this is entirely different. This is a narrative that we're being told not to break against, and we should be presenting every side. Danielle, you did that masterfully when you were host of the morning news on CHQR. It's News Talk 770. It doesn't happen anymore, for what it's
Well,
worth.
it's kind of you to say, and it just felt to me like something's changed quite dramatically in this COVID world. But maybe it's a few things. It's the Me Too movement on top of BLM, on top of discussions around transgender conversion, as well
Climate
as
change.
and you add COVID on top of it. Like there's only one right position to take on that suite of issues that I just raised, and we're going to keep on adding more issues. That there's only one right position to take, and the consequence of not having the right idea or having a guest who doesn't have the right idea is a Twitter storm starts. And when the Twitter storm starts, then advertisers get squeamish. And when advertisers get squeamish, then they call the owners. And then the owners say, why in the world is something trending? Like, what are you going to do about that person? They must have made a mistake. And so that's the vicious cycle that we've got ourselves in. And I really do make a push for that. This is that we've got to now get into a world where we have to pay for our journalism. The advertising model for how we get our news sources has just given an undue amount of influence to the people who pay the bills. And if people are able to put forward $10 a month or $5 a month or pay for their subscription or become a member, that is what is going to create true independent journalism. That's how the alt medias, I think, have really managed to get a niche and have a growing niche. It's very grassroots funding base. And I think that is got to be the model of the future. The other thing I'd say is that when, and you know this as well, Bruce, is because we've got such a heavily regulated television and radio industry through CRTC, is every so often you've got to defend your licenses. You've got to say why you deserve to continue the right to broadcast. And if there's 1,000 Broadcast Standards Council complaints because you've got people who are out there creating controversy, then that's going to affect your license and affect your ability to run your business. So this is the real problem. We create a structural problem that is working against freedom of speech.
We could do an entire segment on this, guys. Truly. But I look, we're running out of time. I want to pick up on a couple of things. Rob, you mentioned them earlier. Jyoti Gondek, the mayor of Calgary, mentioned she wanted to have every unvaxxed city employee have to pay for their own test to work. I think she backed off of those comments. AHS also was initially going to, I believe they're going to fire everybody that didn't get vaxxed. Now they're not doing that. What do you make of those two issues?
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. Like there's some discussion in the legal community now that's, I'm not going to say it's a consensus, but there's certainly a concern with those who are implementing these policies, these mandatory vaccination policies, that these won't stand up in court. And, there's many examples of that, whether it's, if you're employed as a firefighter, for example, by AHS, why on earth would you be required as an employee to have to get a vaccination? You're not in close confines with at-risk people for the most part, and there's ways that your job could be managed so that you don't cause any issues in that regard. These are young people, not at risk for the most part when you're talking about that. And there's so many examples where the one size fits all approach doesn't make any sense, and it's an undue intrusion into people's personal liberty over their body. And I think you're going to see this more and more. You're going to see the province, you're going to see the municipalities start to back off these vaccine mandates, and especially if you said earlier, Bruce, you're worried not everybody has money to bring forward these cases through the courts, but some do. They just take time. That is happening in the background right now. And if we can get one or two solid court decisions on this, then the vaccine passports or the mandatory vaccine policies will be a thing of the past quite quickly.
Thank you, Rob. Danielle, I'll ask you to comment and maybe wrap at the same time.
Yay for union bosses. Like, I'm really hoping it's the union bosses saying, you can't do that. I was waiting for them actually on Labor Day.
Say that.
I know. Well, truly, like, this is the political realignment that is happening now. You've got an authoritarian progressive mayor calling out the Calgary Police Service and saying they're holding them to ransom. And now they're going to be forced to have to pay for rapid testing for the rest of their workers. What a disrespectful way to talk to people who have given their career to public service. So yay for the union bosses for pushing back. But you know what really bothers me? What really bothers me is look at how this began. This began during the federal election with Justin Trudeau saying, we're going to force federal employees to be vaccinated, and we're going to force any federally regulated business to be vaccinated as well. So guess what happened there? Then the chambers and the business leaders kept coming out saying, oh, yes, we need to have mandatory vaccination. We need to be protected with legislation. And where is that legislation, right? So now you see that all of the government entities are backing down. The federal government backed down, the AHS backed down, the municipalities backed down, but nobody's come clean with the business community and said, yeah, you know, that legislation that was supposed to protect you from liability, we can't actually pass that because our caucus rebelled and there's no possible way they're going to let you fire people without severance. So you've got businesses now making this decision on the basis of the leadership that was being pushed on them by the government officials. And now the government officials are all backing down and they're still expected to go ahead with enforcing these mandates. It's a catastrophe. And I hope what happens is we start seeing that the vaccine passports make no sense. Vaccine mandates are unenforceable before it causes too much havoc. We're on the cusp of Christmas. How many people are about to lose their jobs right before Christmas? We've got to see a reversal in the coming weeks. Otherwise, it's going to be just absolutely devastating for people's family situations going into the new year.
Yeah.
Well, Rob, you look like you're chomping at the bit to get one last sentence or two out. I can give you a few more seconds if you like.
No, I was just agreeing with Danielle.
Okay.
This is not. She's right. These businesses have been put into a bad position, but a lot of it's just a lack of courage. Either they didn't have to follow along, they did. With regards to mandate, what I'm talking about here is I'm not talking about the program that restaurants follow to bring people in and so forth for proof of vaccine. I'm talking about people that are being forced to leave their post-secondary institutions, forced into choosing between vaccines and being fired. These types of things, these are unconstitutional. If it's a government entity involved, they're unconstitutional. And if it's a private entity and they get fired for this reason, it's clearly without cause. It's clearly termination without cause, and they should be entitled to severance. These are the cases you're going to see in the next 3-4 months litigated. Specifically this just cause versus cause or without cause case. And I'm confident that the courts are going to find the right way on this and say, look, if you fire someone for not getting a vaccine, a private business, you pay them severance because that's without cause.
Got to leave it here, guys. Rob, Danielle, as always, just a tremendous conversation. So thoughtful. Thank you. And until next time, enjoy yourselves. Be safe. All those things.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Danielle Smith and Rob Anderson, our panelists tonight on Uncensored. I want to remind you too at home, if there's a segment that you would like to see or you would like us discuss a certain issue, you can send me an email, bmcallister@westernstandardonline.com. bmcallister@westernstandardonline.com. There it is on the screen. And Rob and Danielle and I will get another panelist to join us. We'll discuss the issue. What we're trying to do here, as Danielle communicated so eloquently, is bring topics to center stage that need a light shone on them, that we can talk about things that maybe the mainstream media doesn't, and cover them from all angles. So we're doing our best to do that, and we certainly did tonight on COVID. Thank you for joining us, and do send me an email. We'd love to hear from you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.